But from that experience, from that car accident, I eventually got a payout. I got about 150,000 in those days. It was a lot of money. And so when I had reconnected with my daughter's mother in Maryborough, we decided to proceed up to the Atherton Tablelands up out of Cairns, where I bought a house on a couple of acres, and we lived there. But of course, her and me were smoking dope and drinking, and of course going nowhere. But I had a boat, a nice car, a place I finally owned, and if you remember, I was saying I was just a drug addict being homeless, and all of a sudden I've got everything, thinking that I got it made. Well, because I'd never sorted my own head out, I still was in the same place in my head. I was still an addict, so nothing really got better. So one day I came home, and the girl's mother said to me, if you don't sell the place, this was after a year, she said, if you don't sell the place, me and the kids aren't going to be here when you come home. So I had to sell the place only about a year after buying it, lost a whole lot of money. We then proceeded to go to Perth, where my second daughter Vanessa was born. We bought a nice Spanish-style house in the suburbs there with a pool and all that, all very nice with the money I had left. And after another short year, the same thing happened. Sell up, we want to go back to Maryborough, or I'm going to take the kids, and that's it. And because I love my little girls so much, I couldn't imagine that, losing them. So I just sold up again and ended up back in Maryborough. And continuing to take drugs and drink and carry on. Then we had another fight in Maryborough, so I went back to my parents' place, stayed there for a little while. They put up with me for a little while. And then I hitchhiked back up to Maryborough for a visit to see my daughters. And when I got there, they had taken off. The mother had taken her and the children with this fellow, and they had the police after him, was what I was told. So I got a little hotel room in Maryborough, and especially about 30 years ago, it was a pretty small town, very quiet, a little room I had just to myself. And so these little hotel room was all I had, and I was lying in there in the dark, in the middle of the night, worrying about my little girls, wondering where they are, when are they going to come back, who are they with, what's going to happen. I couldn't sleep, I was tossing and turning. I was lying on my stomach about 1 o'clock in the morning, half asleep. Then all of a sudden, my whole body started going up and down on the bed, as if somebody was pushing me up and down on the bed. But there was no point. I could feel no point, like a hand or something pushing me. My whole body was just going up and down on the bed. And then I was fully awake, and it was just silence. But as soon as I became fully awake, I had this feeling of peace. I couldn't explain it, and I wasn't frightened. I knew something strange was happening, but I wasn't afraid. And then this voice came out of the darkness. It was like a musical voice, it was like a human voice. And this voice said to me, "David, do not worry, for yours is the kingdom of heaven." And I thought, okay. So I rolled over and went to sleep. So waking up in the next morning, I was very confused as to what had just happened the night before. And I thought, well, what is this God, if that's what it is, doing? So I thought to myself, well, I'll go to a local church. That's where this God is supposed to be. So I went to the local Church of Christ, I think it was, and just sat in the pews about 10 o'clock in the morning on a Wednesday morning. There was no one there. I was sitting in the pews on my own. And I'm saying to myself, well, this is where you are, God. Where are you? What are you doing? So then all of a sudden, I lost all the feeling in my body. And I couldn't control my arms or any of my limbs. And I just found myself collapsing onto the ground between the pews. And I was lying down there between the pews, not being able to move. But my mind was wide awake. And then this voice came back and told me the 10 Commandments. And I'm listening to this voice telling me the 10 Commandments. And I was just amazed at what was happening to me. And after the 10th commandment, all the feeling in my body started to come back. I was feeling better. I lifted myself up. I sat back up on the seat. I was back normal again. And I yelled out again, what are you doing to me? What do you mean by all of this? So by this time, I had been advised that the children were possibly up north somewhere. So I started to get my bag and go out and start hitching and looking for them. So I hitchhiked, going from town to town. I really didn't know what I was doing. I was just going in the direction where my girls were. And always having my two little darlings on my mind all the time. I couldn't erase that. I didn't want to erase that, but it was always there and they were always in front of me wherever I went. So I was always on the search for them. And in those days, I probably would have been no good to them by that time, even if I had found them. And I really didn't know what to do about these spiritual experiences that I'd had. And I would knock and ask on priests' doors. I'd ask anyone who I thought may know something about the spiritual world and about this God. But no one could tell me anything. And I must have asked 100 different people in my time about what had happened, and nobody could tell me anything. They just said, well, they just thought I think that I was still on the drugs and I was on some hallucination. But it wasn't, it was real. And when these experiences happened to me, I was not on anything. I was quite sober, I hadn't had anything for a week or more. My mind was clear, my body was okay, but I couldn't understand what it was all about. So I continued on to drink and to drug and to search for my kids, to sleep in parks, to sleep on beaches, to supposedly look for my girls and get involved in bits of crime. I ended up in a Rockhampton low security jail for a couple of months is all. Luckily it was the only time I'd been in jail. In my time, I'd been to plenty of local lockups, but not in jail itself. So I was there in jail with everybody else. And I found myself sitting at a dinner table with 3 other men, and they were all in there for murder and armed robbery. And it was a bit of a shock to me. So anyway, I got out of there, luckily, okay, and continued to drink and carry on and ask people about what happened with these experiences I've had. It almost drove me crazy. So I ended up hitchhiking up to a place called Burralula, where I found out my girls were, which is a place up in the Northern Territory. It's like a big Aboriginal mission area. And when I got there, I was told that they had only left a few days earlier. So I just lived and associated with the Aboriginals up there, just drinking with them and sleeping in the park and gambling. And so I moved from there on up to Darwin, hitchhiked and lived in Darwin for a little while, not knowing where I was going, what I was doing. I went to a park there one day where I was staying in a park in Darwin City on the waterfront, and I'd been drinking with these other hobos, and I stood up one day and tripped over, and I rolled and I fell, and I rolled down this hill, and then I was stopped by a tiny little piece of wire. This little thing stopped me from going any further. And when I shook my head and I looked around, I looked over my shoulder, and there was about a 100-foot drop to the rocks below. So I pulled myself gently away from there and got up and went over, then wandered over. The Salvation Army had turned up with a van full of sandwiches and food and drinks for homeless people. So I grabbed a sandwich off this fellow, and I looked at him and I thought, why are these people doing this? What is this God they got? What makes them do such great things? What this God is all about, I don't know. And then I just went on my way and hitchhiking. I came back. I ended up in a place called Catherine on my way back, sleeping under a bridge there. And my health was getting worse and worse. And I was just staying with a couple of Aboriginals under the bridge. And then I continued on. I found myself sitting in an old building torn down in a little town. I didn't even know where I was. And I thought to myself, well, I might continue on, because the next biggest town was Townsville. So I thought if I can get to Townsville, I might go to a rehab, because I've got nothing. So I ended up in Townsville after hitchhiking there. I had about $1.20 in change in my pocket, a bag of old clothes, and I bought my last beer, and I walked in before I walked into the rehab. And in those days it was cheaper. And I walked into the rehab with about 40 cents to my name and a bag of old clothes. Well, I went to detox. I was in detox for about a week and a half or so. And I came out of detox, and I was still obsessed with this God thing. I wanted to know. So I walked into the lady who, in the Salvation Army, who was running the Salvation Army rehab there, her and her husband. Talking to this Salvation Army lady in her office there, I told her these experiences I'd had, these spiritual experiences. And she said to me quite calmly and quite authoritatively, which really made me listen, she said, "Oh, I can tell you what that was all about." And of course, after all I've been through, I nearly fell off the chair. So I said, "Please, what's it about?" Well, she simply said to me, "The first time when Christ came to you, that was to wake up to your silly self," and that was her words. "Come to me because I can heal you." The second experience in the hotel room, where that voice said to me, "David, do not worry, for yours is the kingdom of heaven," she said to me, "Yes, the angel was saying to you, do not worry. Yours is the kingdom of heaven if you want it." That was the key that I was searching for about 6 years. Those few words, if you want it. And the 10 Commandments were a life of love and a better way to live. So I said to her, "Thank you very much. Now I know what I've got to do." And so I raced across down the hall, got on my knees, got into my little room, got onto my knees and gave myself to him. I gave myself to the Lord. And I said, "Lord, please take me. Forgive me of my miserable past. Forgive me of everything of me. Please come into my life, take over my life and renew me." And I said to him then, "So if you do that, if you can do that, I'll give you 60 days. And so there was nothing, no bells, no whistles, no visions, no nothing. Everything was just quiet, still. So I got up and went on my way and went to sleep that night, woke up next morning, and I couldn't understand when I woke up how well I felt. I felt this peace again and this contentment. And for an addict, that is extremely not what happens to an addict. So then I realised that without all the other spiritual experiences, he'd come back after I'd got on my knees and he had actually healed me again, just quietly, after I'd given my life to him. And then I realised, and I was just so full of peace, and I was absolutely and positively on fire for him. And I would talk to Christians who I knew were born again, spirit-filled Christians who would teach me and disciple me as to my next steps. And it was quite unheard of to just be out of detox in a rehabilitation unit and find yourself completely cured of all your addictions. It was just unheard of. And so I started talking to the guys, counselling the guys at the place. In that situations, there's a lot of spiritual warfare, I guess you could say, yeah. And a lot of guys wanting to leave and all mixed up lives and the devil having a great time with them all. But the Salvation Army people were praying for everybody. Each of us had to go to a church on Sunday, the Salvation Army church each Sunday. So there was a lot of spiritual things happening. And I was able to talk to guys and encourage them and tell them what happened to me. And I started going to church. And I felt like a total foreigner at first. I thought, what am I doing here with all these straight, normal people? But then they started teaching, and I started listening, and I started learning about who this God is. And I had to learn who he is and what he wants of me, what he expects of me, and how I am to look to him. And this came in very well-ordered manner. The lady who told me all my answers, who managed the rehabilitation unit, her and her husband took me into their place for Bible study each week. I completed the rehabilitation unit. And of course, when you're giving up addictions, the addictions is one thing. The next hardest thing is changing your life completely. You can't give up drugs and go back to your old life. You can't give up drugs and go back to your old friends, even family. You have to change everything.